Welcome to what is a very special Fridays with Frank. This is a unique privilege. It's not often that you get to have your hero standing next to you about 5,000 miles away and yet only really about 6 or 7 inches away. And one of the things I've started to do on these broadcasts is take the opposite approach of MSNBC or CNN or Fox. I admit my mistakes. And one of the worst mistakes I ever made was the first time that I met Tony Blair. And I was on my computer getting ready for the presentation. It was at 10 Downing Street, so I was grateful to be inside this wonderful historic institution. And I'm on my computer getting the presentation ready. And you know, when the president comes to see you or the prime minister comes and see you, you expect an aide to come and get you and bring you in. And so you can compose yourself. But not Tony Blair. He comes out to get me personally. And he's standing right in front of me, and I'm looking up. And inside my head, I'm going, oh, my God, there he is. And all I could say is that I stand up to shake his hand. You're my second favorite Brit. Now, what the hell comes over someone's mind when your hero is standing before you? And he, in good cheer, says, well, who's your favorite? And I said, Paul McCartney. And as I'm saying it, I'm thinking of Chris Farley in that Saturday Night Live sketch, hitting himself brutally for asking McCartney a stupid question. And if that wasn't bad enough, the next time I saw Tony Blair, I apologized for my first time meeting him and saying Paul McCartney. So Tony Blair, I want to say once and for all, you are my favorite Brit. You are the person, truly the person in this world I admire most. And I'm so sorry the awful, embarrassing introduction. So I need you to forgive me.
No, you made the right call first time round.
No, actually, I would much rather talk to you than talk to him. So
and you've got a pretty good Brit just behind you as well.
Yeah, well, here's what's strange. You're putting a map of Europe behind you, and your country just left there. And I'm putting a former prime minister behind me who I never even met before.
No, I think this is actually an impressionist painting. I mean, it may look like a map of Europe, but I don't think it's supposed to be.
So since that's the focus of kicking this thing off, tell me, has the retreat from Europe, I know you didn't want it, and if you had been in charge, what would you have done differently? Obviously the outcome was not what you sought. And it's unclear what the impact is going to be because we've had a far greater crisis right now. But if you could have been, and you are a great message person, not just a great speaker, what would you have said differently that might have changed the outcome?
I think I would have tried to tell people that in today's world, a country the size of Britain needs strong alliances, and it's got the biggest commercial market and largest political union right on its doorstep. Remember, it takes me less time to get on a train from London to Paris than it does from London to Edinburgh or even Newcastle. So, you know, we're very close by. And look, in the end, as this crisis has shown, in the end, Europe's a collection of nation states. I think people in Britain worried that we were losing our national identity. But the truth is, all the nations in Europe want to keep their national identity. But in today's world, particularly when you're going to have two big dominant powers, America and China, it's sensible, I think, for countries, as well as the alliances they may have, for example, in Britain's case with America, to keep a strong alliance with Europe. Anyway, that would have been the argument I would have made. And, you know, I think in the end, there are many big reasons of history for us to stick together with Europe, imperfect though that is. Now we're out of it, we've got to make our own way. There's no point in rerunning the argument. And therefore, our relationships with individual countries within Europe, and also particularly with the United States, are going to be hugely important to us.
Your institute is involved in the bigger picture, the work that you're doing in Africa, which I will come back to, but particularly the work against nationalism and isolationism. We've seen countries shut off their borders. We say to people, I have a friend of mine who's on this call right now who had to go back to London and really didn't want to go. How are we going to break down these barriers, because they have never been higher in my lifetime than they are right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think there will be a certain instinctive desire on the part of many countries to ensure that, for example, your supply chains for critical goods aren't dependent on other countries, particularly medical supplies. It's one of the things that's come out of COVID. You know, this idea of countries scrabbling around the world trying to tie up deals for masks and protective equipment and ventilators and so on. So there'll be a perfectly rational desire to repatriate some of the supply chains. But if you step back for a moment and look at the broad sweep of history, the global integration and interconnectedness of the world has brought us immense improved prosperity for both wealthy nations and developing nations. We've probably had more people come out of poverty in the last 20 years than ever before in human history. So it's just important we don't lose sight of the fact that being in an interconnected world is actually a great thing. I mean, if you look at all the great technology innovations that you produced in the US or that we produced here in the UK, how many have come from people who've migrated into our countries? You know, migration properly controlled is a good thing, not a bad thing. So I think if we go into nationalism, isolationism, nativism, protectionism, you know, all those I think rather negative ideological positions, I think will do huge damage to ourselves. Now, none of that means that we don't look after our own country's interests, but the point is our country's interests are best served by recognizing that a degree of cooperation with others is in our interests.
While there are people who do agree with you in your country, mine and others, there are an awful lot of countries in Eastern Europe. There are some rising movements in Western Europe. This movement of populism. It's not about integration. It's about isolation. How do you address it? Because I know we're going through it here. I know that there's a big split on immigration. I see that there are more leaders getting elected that take a contrarian point of view to yours than those who embrace yours.
Yeah, so I'm a great believer in politics, that you've got to approach issues analytically, and you've got to set aside all whatever your party instincts push you towards. So if you take an issue like immigration, there are perfectly reasonable concerns about immigration. And if people on the liberal or progressive side of politics ignore those concerns, then they're going to find it very hard to get traction with public opinion because people worry about it. And there are legitimate worries if there aren't proper controls, if people come in without documentation, if there's no sense that there's any order. I always say about immigration, we want rules and not prejudices. So we don't want to be prejudiced against people. On the contrary, stretching across boundaries of faith and culture and ethnicity is a good thing, but you've got to have rules and order and structure. So that's where I actually fought my last general election campaign on the issue of immigration, was what the Conservative Party at the time were running on, and I had a policy to deal with people's concerns, which I would actually have today as well, which is a concept of biometric. You could do today biometric identity, so that you know exactly who should be in your country and who not. If you want to deal with immigration, deal with it, deal with the problems, but don't put yourself in a position where you become, in inverted commas, anti-immigrant, because that's really not sensible for your country.
You won 3 times. You got bigger majorities than any labor leader. That you were the most successful labor leader of all time. You took a third way approach. You took a centrist approach. The conservatives moved to the right since then. Labor moved to the left since then. Could someone like you, and I'm watching this because in America we're going to have an election in 5.5 months and we are more divided than ever. Could someone like you win today in the UK? Could someone like you win today in America?
Yeah, it's a pretty big debating point. I mean, my answer is unhesitatingly yes, but there are 2 things about centrism for it to work. First of all, it's got to be based on belief. It's not about splitting the difference between right and left. It's based essentially on the view that today's challenges are practical and require practical solutions, not ideological solutions based on what is really quite old-fashioned left or right thinking. So the first thing is that centrism's got to be a belief system and not just an attempt to kind of triangulate between the right and the left. I don't think that ever works. The second thing is that it's got to be, the center's got to be the place where you make radical change. In other words, if you end up in an era where people want change, and out of this COVID-19 crisis, I mean, we're going to wake up to a new normal, a new economy, probably new social norms, and you've got to be able to be the change makers, not the guardians of a status quo that's losing its force and its attraction. So the thing about the center is it's got to be based on conviction, and it's got to be the place of change, not the place simply of managing the status quo. And centrism has gone out of fashion, in my view, because it's stopped being both of those things. It's looked like it's a kind of mushy middle. And in an era where people are saying, look, the whole world's changing, you appear to be just cautious people rather than people able to make the bold changes that are necessary, but bold changes based on what will actually work. I mean, real solutions based on evidence, based on reason, based on how the world's changing.
But what I've seen in the polling in Britain, in France, and Germany, in the US, and in Canada, is not necessarily a rejection of the center. It's a righteous indignation and an ugliness. And one of the reasons why I was drawn to you back in 1997 and I watched your rise is because you never talk that way. You never use that kind of ugly politics. That it is not just an extremism of policy, which I would argue that it really isn't. It's an extremism of tone, that you have to resent or dislike or even hate your enemy, that they become your enemy rather than your opponent. How can we bring this election back? The language, frankly, of some people in British politics and a lot of people in American politics, French politics, you would not let your kids talk that way, and yet these are the leaders of the country. How do we soften up and get people to rise to a higher level in how we communicate?
We've got to have a little more faith in them. I just, look, I've spent my entire life in politics trying to get things done, because that's the toughest thing. The toughest thing ever in politics is to achieve a result, get a consequence. Because the problem with politics is it's often just talk, or you're just sort of carving out a space amongst various interests, which space can often be very narrow. I don't resent people who don't agree with me. My advice always to people in the Democrat Party, for example, in the US, is you've got to understand why Donald Trump won if you want to beat him. Likewise, you've got to be prepared in the UK to understand why Brexit happened, and be brutally frank with yourself about that, and see where you can then take some of that space and work out a set of ideas where you're meeting people's legitimate anxieties and trying to help pull them away from sort of brutal dislike of their opponents. And it depends what you believe in. But, the trouble is what happens when you get these extremes. I've just read a really interesting book, which is a short book, and it's called 1931. And it's actually about the debt crisis in Germany and the rise of Hitler. And it's a very interesting book, a very easy to read book written by a Swiss academic. But essentially the two things that really come out of it. The first is that it absolutely was not inevitable that this happened, that there were actually smart, moderate people, but they always felt themselves too constrained by events to do what they really needed to do to get a solution that didn't open the way for the extremists. But the second thing that's fascinating is the degree to which the rise of the Nazis was also helped by the extremism of the left. In other words, the two kind of played off against each other and led to a point where the people in the middle felt they just had to choose between communists and Nazis in the end. And well, actually with a very small number of people, because he never actually won a majority, we know what happened. But so the thing that is important for me in the politics that I represent is that I think we've got to be much more muscular in standing up for a decent way of doing politics. Because in the end, if we don't, you just divide people into two groups who don't talk to each other, listen to each other, or like each other. You carry that on for a length of time, then you get to the point where eventually people say, you know what, these other people, I disagree with them so much, they're not legitimate. And that's when you've got a big challenge. And this COVID thing is going to be tricky because at the moment, there's people, in some ways, there's a great sense of people coming together. But as I keep saying to people here in the UK, I am terrified about the economic damage. I think we're going to emerge from the tunnel of this and survey wreckage everywhere on the economic front. And you just can't tell the turn that politics is going to take when that happens. So what at the moment, I don't know whether it's like this in the US, there's a sort of air of unreality about the life and the world we're in. And, we're all doing this strange, all of us, all our lives have changed in the way we lead our lives. But I just feel when people then emerge sort of blinking back into what used to be the normal landscape, that's when we've got to watch the politics.
So I'll do it delicately to allow you to answer delicately. We are being told by many of our leaders that the worst is over, that things are starting to open up. I know you use a different phrase in Britain. What is it? Restart or exit from exit from COVID. You like that exit line. You guys use it year after year. I'm expecting to make it like Kexit or Covexit or something like that. But we are being told that the light's at the end of the tunnel, and a lot of Americans don't believe it. We're getting horrible unemployment numbers. We see stores shutting down. We know that it's going to be slow to open up, that even if you give people money, they don't want to spend it. We had a more rational approach a few years ago to challenges like this. Now we're being told everything's going to be okay very soon. How do you engage in politics when you have that language coming from the top? Who are we supposed to trust, and why are we supposed to trust them?
Firstly, this is the most difficult challenge I've ever known in politics. So I have total sympathy for anyone who's in government at the moment trying to deal with this situation. Because you're balancing risk, and you're balancing risk in respect of a disease where we're constantly learning new things, most of them not very comforting. And the reality is that your risk is, if you carry on with a severe lockdown, the damage that you will do economically, socially, and in health terms. So we reckon in the UK, we're going to have a significant rise in the number of deaths from cancer, from heart disease, from strokes, because of the focus on COVID-19. So the only way through this as a political leader is you've got to, I think you've just got to open up with people and tell them very honestly, look, these are the challenges. Here's how we're trying to chart our course. We're trying to do it based on the evidence, but at a certain point, the evidence won't tell you clearly what to do, and you've got to exercise a judgment. Now, the only thing I think where I would say, certainly from the UK's point of view, we've got to do more is you have to build what I call the containment infrastructure. In other words, the testing, tracing, tracking ability, the provision of things like masks where it's helpful for people, for public transport particularly, everything that can give people as much confidence as possible. But then I'm afraid you've got to be in a position where you lead people and say, we've got to get back. And that normal, by the way, will be a new normal. I mean, I don't know what the situation is with you, but I would say there are whole industries in the UK at the moment that, okay, the government's providing support at the moment, but, what's the future for the airlines, the tourist industry, hospitality, bricks and mortar retail? it's for at least a year, they're going to be in severe difficulties. And then I think you've also got to look at the world of work and how it's going to change, because I suspect when we end this, some people will not go back to working normally because they're frightened, and some people will not go back to working normally because they've decided the new way of working that they experienced during lockdown is actually perfectly good for them. But that then has got massive implications for, you know, the way people live, what they buy, how businesses are structured. So I think, you know, I would, if I was back in government today, I'd put in a lot of effort in the containment structure and then a massive engagement with the business sector to see how we make sense of this. Because otherwise, I think you will find that there are whole categories of people, probably the most poor and disadvantaged, who just are left completely beached by this.
You walk around outside?
Yeah, no, you can walk around outside, and that's, you know, people go to parks and so on and so forth, and people take exercise, that's all fine. But there's a lot of resistance here, for example, to opening schools, even though I think the evidence is that particularly for younger age children, they're really, you know, there isn't much of a risk. But, you know, the school's a classic example. So if you say to a politician, a political leader, so tell me there's no risk in opening the school, you can't say that. You've got to say there is, but I think it's manageable. And the risk of letting a whole generation of children miss out on a significant part of their schooling is also very significant. And there are lots of poor kids that need to go to school, frankly, in order to get the nutrition they need.
When you go outside, do you use a mask?
Not because I'm here and I'm actually walking in an enclosed space. So, but if I was out on public transport now, yeah, for sure.
And one more question domestically, and then we need to talk about the Middle East and about your efforts in Africa. As we come out of this, the public is more gentle to each other. In the polling that we do, people are more likely to extend a hand, a helping hand, to cooperate with each other, to be nicer to each other. By almost 4-to-1, people report acts of kindness rather than acts of meanness, even though that's what we see on television. In politics, in America, the governors and the president are fighting with each other. And Governor Chris Christie was a great example when he was appreciative of getting aid from Barack Obama, and he put aside his partisanship and thanked the president and did so publicly and did not have this ugliness. A lot of other governors have taken an opposite approach. I've watched a couple of your debates in Parliament, and it's still very confrontational. Could this be the beginning? And I know that Parliament is by nature confrontational. Could COVID bring the politicians together, or is it more likely that people will try to seize an advantage, seize an opportunity, and just make the whole system worse?
I think it
not what you want, what you think will happen.
Which one do I want to happen is obvious. Which one do I think will happen? I think here there will be a desire for politicians to pull together, but it's always got to come from the leading politicians themselves. I mean, people in the end can go in different directions. They can have their fears exploited, or they can have them calmed. You know, they can have their opponents' ideas criticized, or they can have their opponents' integrity criticized. Ideas being criticized is one form of debate. If you criticize the person's integrity and sort of morality and honesty, that's a rougher, cruder, harsher form of debate. So I'm no doubt at all the public will respond to leadership that brings people together. But it is in the nature of modern politics that it's rough, and social media, as you and I have discussed on many occasions, Frank, social media is a revolutionary phenomenon, and it's you know, it does create the era of the loudmouth. You know, I always say to people, I mean, it's a, you know, one of the first lessons you ever learn, not just in politics, but in life, is that the people who shout loudest don't deserve to be heard most. But social media kind of rewards the people that shout loudest. So, you know, it's a huge complicating factor in modern politics. But even so, I believe people understand that and are prepared to rise above it.
I will tell you that is extremely depressing to me. And we've had this conversation that right now during COVID, that people are saying that because governors are making certain decisions or because the president is, I've heard the commentary in your country as well. Fortunately, it's only on the extreme, but people are saying that lives, that people aren't here anymore and they use much more abusive language. I won't even say it on a closed call. I just find that so offensive because the outcome of that is nothing but bad. That's not just when you hate your enemy, that's when you think your enemy is evil. I promise I'm going to the Middle East because that's where the questions are coming from. But there's a wonderful quote, and it's appeared in the US, appeared in Britain, and it describes who you are. More is lost by indecision than by the wrong decision. So if you're looking forward, not today and not backward, in addition to what you've already raised, what are the decisions, what are the things that need to happen in the coming weeks so that the months and years are not tragic?
I think preparing for what this new normal looks like, working that out with business, making sure that I think there's going to be and should be an enormous acceleration of the enabling technology to allow us to do things differently and better. Because for one thing, you're going to have to drive costs through, you know, the elimination of costs through the system. Otherwise, you're going to run up just massive, massive deficits. And I think there's got to be some sense that whatever disagreements there are, for example, between the US and China, there's got to be some space for cooperation.
Is China an enemy? Is China an adversary? Is China an opponent or just a competitor?
Well, it could be any of those things at any one point in time. I mean, the way I look at it is you've got a space that is probably going to be confrontational because, you know, the Chinese system is different. The Chinese Communist Party has consolidated its grip. The hopes that as China rose economically, so it would evolve politically in the direction of the West, those hopes, for the moment at least, have turned out not to be right. There's going to be a space for competition for sure. I think in technology, there will be a massive competition between America and China, between the West and China. But I think there's still going to be a space for cooperation because some of the problems we're dealing with can't be dealt with unless together. And, you know, one thing that's surely going to come out of this COVID crisis is a desire to reform the international architecture around healthcare so that we are much better prepared for pandemics in the future. I mean, I would have thought that's obvious. So, and we should also never confuse the Chinese Communist Party with the Chinese people or China with the Chinese Communist Party. So, but this is, I mean, it's a whole other topic, but I think that geopolitical relationship is going to be one huge, huge, huge issue in the coming years. And whereas it's been an issue in American politics for some time, I would say it's an issue now in UK and European politics too.
And the US right now, we have both presidential candidates trying to become more anti-China than each other, trying to show that the other one took China at its word and made a mistake. And it sure sounds like they're trying to build up the Chinese government, as an enemy. Knowing how they handle COVID-19, you still won't use that word.
No, I think it's dangerous to, when you declare, look, this isn't like the Soviet Union. It's a threat that's different in nature. Chinese power is bound to rise, right? That economic force carries with it political force and carries with it in the end military force. That's inevitable. And my view has always been that the West, because I think Europe should stand with America, and this has got to be powerful enough to deal with China in whichever direction it goes. So if it goes in a more and more aggressive direction, we've got to be prepared and able to deal with it. But we've also got to understand this is different. And it's different because China's a country with natural geopolitical ambitions because of its size and its weight. And China's economy is going to matter to us, whether we like it or we don't like it. When the Cold War ended, America's trade with the Soviet Union, I think America imported $200 million worth of goods from the Soviet Union. In 2018, the figure was 556 billion. So you're looking at a different order of relationship. So yes, I think there's going to be increased standoff. I think that's for absolutely sure. But what I would say is, rather than trying to deal with China on a kind of ad hoc reactive basis, you need a strategic framework within which America has strong allies in confronting China where necessary, competing where it has to, but also cooperating where it has to.
I'm glad that you have senators and congressmen and governors listening to you right now, because they need to deliver that message to Washington. I don't think they're hearing it. I can't end this. It's a challenge. I can't end this conversation without the Middle East. There has been no Western leader who has spent more time shuttling back and forth between countries, between leaders, between think tanks and grassroots organizations than you. And you've committed your life to it. And yet right now, as we do this interview, Israel appears ready to annex parts of the West Bank, which will set off a pretty ugly global reaction. Abbas has said that the Palestinians are pulling out of cooperative agreements that they signed a number of years ago. It actually looks, at the same moment that Israel is talking to Saudi Arabia, that Israel is talking to the UAE, at the same moment that there are advances, there seem to be real problems between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What's going on, and what should be done as we go forward?
So I could kind of bore everyone forever on the detailed bits around the peace process, but let me just take a step back and do it at the very macro level. And, you know, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, obviously, post 9/11, through Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. I spent a lot of time in office dealing with these issues. In my view, essentially, the Middle East is trying to escape two problems. It's trying to escape the problem of the abuse of religion, the turning of the religion of Islam into a political ideology, and alongside that, often as the alternative to it, more secular governments that were corrupt, didn't deliver for their people, didn't do a good job. Now, the whole of the struggle in the Middle East is really for societies of religious tolerance, because that's the only way to the future, and rule-based economies. Not necessarily democracies, but rule-based economies. In other words, if you work hard and play by the rules, you can make a living for yourself and for your family. So every single conflict in the Middle East is really about the forces on the one side trying to drive this religious extremism, on the Sunni side through the Muslim Brotherhood, on the Shia side through the Iranian Islamic Republic. And against that is arraigned those people that understand you've got to modernize society and put religion in its proper place. And it's really into that whole kind of cultural problem that the Israeli-Palestinian issue fits, because it's at its heart as much about cultural acceptance as it is about exactly where the border goes and who has what bit of territory. So the only thing I say to you that gives me cause for optimism is that I think there is an emergent group of people in the Middle East, not yet sufficiently in positions of power, but they're coming, they're emerging, who believe, one, that the problems of the Middle East are of their own making, not someone else's. And two, that this concept of religiously tolerant societies and rule-based economies is the way to go. And if there's anything that gives me hope, that's the reason, by the way, why the Israelis and the Arabs are together. It's not just because they both fear the power of Iran. It's also because there's a genuine appreciation in the leadership of some of the Arab nations about what the state of Israel is and what it's created. And that is therefore a deeper coming together than merely a security relationship. So that's a long way of saying, yes, things look very bleak in the Middle East today, but the battle lines are very clear. And all I'd say to the West is get on the side of the modern people. Don't think it's sensible to leave the Middle East to Iranian, Russian, and other influence, because that won't change the Middle East in the way we need.
So, you know, I'm a language guy, and I listened to Tone. I listened before we came on. We joked about our backdrops. And when you answered that question, you answered a little bit more slowly than other questions. And I'm curious if you are particularly careful about the words that you use in the Middle East, that British politics is either easy for you or it's not fraught with as much danger, that you are actually, that you have to think more, or that you are more careful about what you say about those countries.
Yeah, a bit. I think that's true. There's something else, though, which is that very few people analyze the Middle East in a conceptual way. So actually, the first article, I wrote it just recently, that I've really written about the Middle East peace process, even though I've been deeply involved in it, was trying to persuade the Palestinians why they needed a fundamental change of strategy in order to succeed. And you know, I weighed every word. I've spent more time, you know, sharpening the language on that and getting it right, because it is difficult. But it's also because, you know, one of the things that's fascinating about politics, if you're a student of it, is that it's always important at a certain point to step back and try and look at what I call the and in the big picture, certain things that if you're only looking at them seem a complete mess, you can make sense of if you step back and look at that big picture. And the Middle East is very like that to me. So a lot of people will tell you it's ridiculously complicated, it's absolutely riven, there's no prospect and no chance. And what I say is, no, if you actually look at the big picture, you can see a movement happening that is really important and very important for our future.
I got two more because I'm being told by your guys I got to wrap up. One of them is Iran. Can the West accept a nuclear Iran?
No.
So what do we do? What do we do?
We've got to put the pressure on them. And I would like to see a way that Europe and America could come back together on Iran, because there's the nuclear issue, and then there's what Iran does in the region, the destabilization. And if you look, for example, at Iraq at the moment, the new Iraqi prime minister, by the way, is someone who really needs and deserves our support. You know, the regime is destabilizing enough. You give them nuclear weapons capability, this would be a bad mistake.
So the last question is about faith. And there are about 160 people on this call, but I'm asking you personally about this as someone who we've known each other now for about 15 years. And I'm going to read it to you because I don't want to get one word wrong. And it's the serenity prayer, because it really does matter more today than ever. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Tony, help me. How do we learn or know the difference between what we can do and what we can't do, and what do we set our minds to?
So I think the Serenity Prayer was actually written or attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, right? And I think I'm right in saying as well that the earliest version he had of that put the courage before the serenity. But we should check that. But I think what he really meant by that is not that you shouldn't continually strive to make the world better. And the courage to do that and the determination to do that should always be the anchor of your politics. I think what he meant was about the serenity was to make sure that the change that you're making is change that can practically work. So it was not a diminution of your ambition, but more a qualification of it, that don't have big ideas that don't work. Make sure the big ideas do work. But I think the hardest thing is not having the serenity. In a way, it's having the courage.
And finally, I know you've got courage, and I know you have wisdom. Do you have serenity?
I'm working on that one, Frank. It's work in progress. I'll tell you what, one interesting thing, I know a lot of people nowadays who do meditation. I've never got to be able to do it. And I keep thinking I should really try it, because it's a very smart people. You remember Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore? Fantastic guy, amazing guy. He's the last person in the world you'd think is anything other, is serene, as it were. But I remember him telling me in the years before he passed away that meditation was a big part of his life. And I think, you know, if you're a restless person like me, you know, you should work on serenity all the time. And I admire enormously the people who've got it.
Well, over the last few months, I've actually found a little of it. I've got a candle that I light, and my mantra is the longest word ever, but it's reconciliation. Because if we can bring people together of disparate backgrounds and religions and beliefs and goals in life, amazing things can happen. I'm thankful for the time that you gave me. You only lost, I'm looking at the count, you only lost 4 people in the last 49 minutes. Your staff is going to kill me for keeping you on for this long, because I only asked you for half an hour. We are grateful. Please give my best to your family.